In 1933, Fred Bear created a legacy, pursuing his lifelong passion. Fred's mission was to ensure archery remains accessible to everyone. Here at Bear Archery, we promise to never forget the principles our brands were founded on. From the youngest archer to the oldest, we strive to build bows that give you the best shooting experience. Visit beararchery.com to discover more.
Midway USA brand product designers have one straightforward goal: develop high-quality, technically sound products and deliver them to customers at reasonable prices. If you are immersed in the shooting sports industry and pay close attention to every single detail, you know our products are built right and stand up to everyday use. Who has shooting mats and range bag systems to hunting clothing and just about everything for the outdoors? Log on and shop 24/7 with super fast shipping. MidwayUSA.com.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of CastingAcross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. We had a pre-Halloween snow in New England, where I live, north of Boston, and that is a common thing around here, and a common thing kind of across the parallel that I live at in the United States, where I've lived in Chicago, and we've had pre-Halloween snows. I have family out in Colorado, and they had a lot of snow early in October of this year, and that's something that's been happening for decades. It's been something that's happened for centuries, so this isn't some new, novel climate change-related thing. It's just the reality of late fall and early winter. But we're still in a really great time for fly fishing. I mean, if you're fishing for spring spawning fish, and so you're not messing with trout that are spawning in the fall, there's some awesome fly fishing opportunities. I think fish are designed, like most other critters, to realize that things are starting to get a little bit different. And although the air temperature is cold enough to bring about snow, and you're going to have some really, really chilly days, the water temperatures really haven't dropped to the point where the fish are going to go very, very, very sluggish. But the reality is that fish are going to eat year-round. You're just going to have to try different things. Not necessarily harder. The hard thing is switching your approach. It's not necessarily harder fishing. Now, are there going to be prolific hatches? Are there going to be fish that are feeding very aggressively? Not necessarily, but there's still a lot of great fishing that can be had once winter weather sets in. So I've talked about this a few times before, and actually one of my very first podcasts when I started the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast, talk about kind of like getting your head around fly fishing in the winter, because it really is, like I mentioned before, largely a mental game. If you go out in December trying to fish like it's June, you're going to be very, very discouraged, and you're going to be very confused as to why there aren't fish that are hopping at your humpy left, right, and center. But if you change your approach, then you can find a lot of success. I'll touch on some more particulars in this podcast, but you can go back to listen to that one. I think it's probably one of the first 5. And then I think last winter I talked about dressing for winter fishing. And that's a great episode also, because I've had that question a lot. And when I used to sell fly fishing gear, that was one of the questions I got most frequently. How can I be the warmest with the least amount of clothing on? Because no one likes to feel like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man or a sumo suit when they're out there fly fishing. It's not comfortable under normal circumstances. It's definitely not comfortable in waders, and it is absolutely terrible if you build up a real sweat walking in all of those layers to the water, and then you get in that cold water and you get very cold very quickly. So that's a good podcast episode to serve as an adjunct to what I'm talking about today. But today I want to talk about a couple of things that I would do when fishing in the wintertime. Now, you might have the benefit of fishing a spring creek or fishing some sort of water that has a warm influence in it. And these will absolutely work in those situations. I think every fish kind of responds similarly, even if they go through a wider temperature swing in the waters that they inhabit. And of course, I think I want to throw out there also, you have to consider the ethical implications of your fishing. First and foremost, check the local and state regulations. And then secondly, if you are fishing for these fish in extremely cold weather, then exposing them to the air for any prolonged period of time can be very, very dangerous to them. But as long as there's flowing water and you fish for them safely, then you're okay. I mean, think about how many fish are caught and released in the ice and do just fine. So anyway, some things that you can do as you get out there. So the first thing that I find that you need to do when you are coming to a new water that you haven't fished in the wintertime, or if you are new to fishing in winter weather and winter temperatures, is to find trout, right? You got to know where they are. They're not going to be in the same places. They're not going to be inches below the surface under normal circumstances. They're usually not going to be hanging out in slack water, which is not getting as much current and it's probably a lot colder than the moving water. So there's exceptions to all of those, situations and circumstances, and that's just the nature of fly fishing. But you're going to try to find those fish. And so my first go-to, if I'm not seeing fish feeding, if I haven't spotted them, using my polarized sunglasses, is to dead drift a streamer as a prospecting tool. I dead drift a streamer as a prospecting tool. So fish are very, very simple organisms. They want to eat, they want to survive, and they want to pass on their genes to the next generation. That's really all they're looking to do. And so when it comes to that eating quotient of their living, then they are running a very complex formula in their head that they've been designed to do without, needing a calculator or anything like that, of, is this meal worth my energy? And so in temperature extremes, extremely warm water and weather, extremely cold water and weather, then having to chase something down that is small is not worth their time. Now, again, there's always exceptions if they're particularly hungry, if they haven't eaten, or if the mood just strikes them, because fish, they have moods, then they'll go after it. But generally speaking, you want to provide them with a sizable meal that's easy enough to get. So everyone loves chucking big, long streamers and ripping them through the water really fast. Well, that does elicit a lot of strikes during the normal part of the season on most waters. But using a small streamer and dead drifting it, making it act like a fish that has succumbed to the elements, some sort of bait fish or other sort of aquatic life that is just tumbling along dead. It can be as simple as a woolly bugger. It does not need to be some complicated, multi-segmented, articulated fly. Woolly bugger will do fine. Muddler minnow will do fine. A really good fly is Shank's white minnow. You're looking for something that's meaty and something that has marabou or another fiber that is going to pulsate and move around the water without you having to pull it through the water. So marabou is fantastic, and then, like a woolly bugger, you've got the marabou in the back, the hackle on the body, and it's going to move on its own, and that's what makes that so enticing to fish. And so you're going to fish this in smaller patterns. I mean, if the fish are really, really finicky and you suspect that they're smaller, you can fish these down to like a size 12 or 14. But for normal circumstances, you can fish them in like a 6, 8, or 10. And you're going to cast them against rocks that are in the middle of the water. You're going to cast them through deeper holes. You're going to cast them into undercut banks, again, where there's current, not on the side of the stream that might be more slack water, but you're going to cast into the undercut banks where there's current, drifted under roots. All those places that you would anticipate big fish to be holding during the normal part of the season, these are now the real estate that almost all the fish are going to be holding, because they're going to be laying low, trying to find some sort of thermal refuge. And putting these in their faces is a great way to figure out where the fish are hiding. Are they orienting more towards those undercut banks where they might be getting a little bit more warmth? Or are they going down to the bottom of pools where there may be a spring seep or something like that? Or they just have, again, that thermal refuge at the bottom of the pool. But using a pattern like this is nice for a few reasons. One, it's going to offer a little bit of resistance in the water, so you're going to be able to feel when that fish takes, or even when it ticks and it hits it and maybe just is messing around with it. You're going to be able to notice when that fish is going to hit that fly, which is always helpful when you're trying to locate trout. So using a streamer that already has resistance and in the water, you're going to notice a lot easier that there's a change rather than something that is really, really light and microscopic and you're having to detect a very, very subtle bite. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a big, meaty streamer is going to be on the right side of that energy versus caloric consumption equation. So that's exactly what you're looking for. They're not having to chase it down if you put it within a few foot radius of their head or their feeding lane, but it's going to provide them with the kind of incentive to move a little bit to go ahead and take it. But, again, there's always exceptions, but you're not going to be getting those violent strikes. A lot of them are going to just take it as subtly as they would a nymph. And this is a great technique to use year-round, honestly, but it is my preferred prospecting method if I'm hitting a new stream or I've not fished this particular stream before in the wintertime, because it is a great way to at least get some fish to move. And again, as a prospecting tool, you don't have to stay committed to it. Once you realize, all right, there are fish in the bottom of these pools, there are fish in this run, there are fish under the banks, then what do? You say, okay, I'm not getting a lot of takes, but I am getting some swipes. I am seeing them turn their heads. Then you say, okay, well, maybe this is a little bit too aggressive for them. They don't want to go after these. Or it's they're smaller fish. They're 10, 12, 14-inch fish. They're not going to be chasing down these big streamers. So either you downsize the streamer that you're fishing, or you switch over to a nymph rig, and you're able to fish a nymph. And it could be even a meaty nymph. I mean, that's honestly what I would do as you're trying to diagnose what's happening. Are they swiping at this fly, coming out to this fly, giving it a look because it is large, or because it is something that's swimming by, or is it because they are just curious? And so if you go from a streamer that's got a lot of action to maybe like a big stonefly nymph, then you are just eliminating one variable. And if they're still coming after it but backing off because maybe they just are skeeved out by a big fly, now you know to drop down to just a hare's ear or a pheasant tail or even some sort of midge pattern. But that way you can kind of scale it down. But those streamers are great tools for being able to get fish to at least move on your fly. So use a streamer as a prospecting tool by dead drifting it through likely spots. The second thing, which is you can actually do this with the technique I just talked about, is to use a nymphing rod. All right, but you don't have to get fancy with your nymphing. So the takes are going to be subtle, generally speaking, in the wintertime, because fish are waiting for things to come across their path and they're not going to be acting as aggressively. Again, and I say this only to cover my rear end, but there's always exceptions to all these things. But I find that having a tighter connection to my fly is much more valuable in situations where the water is very cold and the fish aren't going to be acting as aggressively. So if I have a couple more feet of fly rod, then that allows me to maintain a better connection with my rod tip, my line, my leader, my tippet, and my fly. So a nymphing rod will come in handy here. Now, I think we've kind of gotten past this, but I still see this sentiment online and hear this sentiment from people that is, I'm not going to be a Euro nympher. I'm not going to come up with some complicated rig and some weird line that isn't really fly line and not casting. And so one of these rods is not for me. I don't want an 11-foot 3-weight. And I get that. And honestly, that's not my preferred way of nymphing either. But I do like a few more feet of reach, and I'm able to maintain that tighter connection with my fly. And that's true year round. But in the wintertime, I found it to be very, very valuable as I have sought out where fish are to be able to control where that fly is in the water column and to maintain a very, very tight connection with that fly. And so you don't have to get fancy with your nymph rig, but by using a longer, lighter fly rod that's designed for nymphing, you're able to kind of continue down that prospecting path, but you're able to detect those strikes much, much better than even if you're using an indicator rig. Indicators are great, but indicators, I would say that they suffer the most with very subtle takes on water that has any sort of movement or chop on it. And indicators aren't foolproof. No matter what kind of indicator you use, you're going to be missing fish just because there is something in between you and that fly. And there's going to be strikes you're not able to detect, and the more subtle the take, the less likely that you are to detect it. And I see fish do this in all sorts of situations. One of the great things about fishing crystal clear water, spring creeks and places where you can kind of be on top of the fish, is you can watch the different ways they take flies. Some of them open their mouths up wide. Others, they act like my 2-year-old when he's trying some new food. They open their mouth just enough so it goes in there, and as soon as it hits their lips, fish don't have lips, but whatever. As soon as it hits it, they're done. They move their head and they're yuck, spit it out. So realize that if that happens and you can see it happen and you can't set the hook because it happens so quickly, how often is that maybe happening 4 feet under your indicator with your indicator 20 feet away from you? And what are the odds that you're going to catch that fish? You know what? We probably catch those fish, but it's when we are pulling back to our false cast and it just so happens to be at that precise moment. I would love to know how many fish take our nymphs when they're on indicator rigs 20, 30 feet away from us that we have no clue. I bet we all are just really killing it. We just never know. So anyway, use a nymphing rod, but don't get fancy. But just use it, again, as a nice direct line between you and your fly. And get rid of the indicator. Nothing wrong with indicators. You can use them, but this is just one technique that I find that you're able to also prospect for fish in this manner. And speaking of nymphing rods, I'll talk about my recommendation for a nymphing rod if you don't have one at the end of this podcast, so stick around. You should stick around. I talk about good stuff at the end. All right. Third thing, fish the sun, but watch out for the sun. Fish the sun, but watch out for the sun. I think I've talked about this before in another context, but I didn't feel like going back through 100+ episodes of the podcast. But fishing the sun is a very, very important thing to do when the weather gets colder, especially once the water gets colder, because if you're fishing any body of water, the sun is going to not just warm up the water, but it's going to have a very, very significant impact, relatively speaking, on the temperature of that water as it warms up the stream bed. This is one of the reasons why conservation organizations protect riparian streamside growth of shrubs and canopy, because when that sun comes up in the middle of the summertime, it will bake the dark or even the light stream bottoms of these creeks, and that will increase the temperature significantly, causing real big problems for cold water species. But we can use that to our benefit in the wintertime because the stream bed will warm up enough and the fish are going to gravitate to those spots. And so see where the sun is shining on the shallower water. So it's not going to have as much of an impact on those deep green and deep blue pools where you can't see the bottom. But if there are maybe riffles on the front end or the back end of a pool like that, and as the sun comes up and has been out for a few hours, you're thinking like early afternoon or something like that, those are the spots where fish might not be in that place in the morning, but as that water warms up, or even as there's a little bit of radiant heat coming off of those rocks on the stream bottom, they're going to move up and out of those pools, or even out from undercut banks where they're in the shadows, where they were getting some sort of refuge, but now they're taking the advantage of the warmer water, kickstarts their metabolism just a teeny tiny bit, and they're going to be more evident. And what that also does is that potentially gets the bugs moving, and so it's the whole life cycle of everything going on in that ecosystem gets kickstarted for a few hours, even in the shortest days, by the sunshine. It's really cool to see even just a few bugs coming off and fish keying on those. So target those spots, shallower water where the sun hits. So that is fish the sun. But the other part of that is watch out for the sun, because you no longer have the benefit of canopy and streamside vegetation around you in the wintertime. Now, could you be fishing someplace where there's like rock walls or just really, really high banks or lots of pine trees? Yes. But generally speaking, wintertime, things fall off the trees. Leaves are not there. There's not as much underbrush. And so you are going to be casting a shadow a lot more, and you're going to be throwing a silhouette a lot more. We all know about shadows. Shadows are bad. Fish don't like shadows. Shadows could be anything awful and dangerous to them. So never cast a shadow over a spot you're trying to fish. And then also silhouettes. We don't think about silhouettes as much, but if that cone of vision that a fish has, which this is not great radio, but definitely Google it, like a fish's cone of vision, but they can see in front of themselves, but then up, but then because of the refraction of the water, they can see at a wider angle than you can probably expect them to see. So it's really important to kind of have this in mind as you approach fish. How did I spook that? I'm so far away, I'm so low. Well, the water actually magnifies and opens up that fish's vision, and that is variable depending on how deep that fish is under the water. So that's definitely something to Google and check out. Not great for describing on a podcast, but there's plenty of resources. I guarantee you something like Orvis has in their learning center some pictures and diagrams of how a fish's cone of vision works. But there's classic books back from the 50s and 60s that have some great information on this, and current contemporary books have it also. But don't throw a silhouette, because you don't have that benefit of streamside vegetation behind you to mask your silhouette as much as you would in the spring, summer, and fall. So dead drift to streamer as a prospecting tool. Use a nymphing rod just to fish. Don't get too fancy with it if you don't want to. Fish the sun / watch out for the sun. The last bit of advice for fishing in winter and cold weather is your guides. Now, we all know that guides ice up, and it is one of the more frustrating things when that happens, and because you can't strip line to cast. When you are maybe even reeling it in, it is going to get stuck and cause problems. And of course, ice is very, very sharp at a kind of a microscopic level. I mean, ice can be sharp at a macro level, but definitely at a microscopic level, and that's not good for your expensive fly line, because you're fishing expensive fly line, right? You better be fishing expensive fly line. It's a very, very good investment. So, but you don't want it to get gashed up by ice, and you definitely don't want to pop that ice off of your guides. That is a great way to snap your little snake guides. It's a great way to even just to damage already compromised epoxy now that it's cold enough that ice is forming on it by popping that ice through that guide. So what do you do? Well, if you don't have anything that I'm going to mention here in a second as far as prevention, then you can do one of two things. The first is just hold that guide in your hand. Allow it to melt. Sometimes it's just the tip top because of how much water your line is carrying, how long of casts you're making. If you aren't maybe fishing a streamer or stripping something in, you're just getting a little bit of motion with a little bit of wet line through your tip top. So just hold it in your hand, allow it to melt, and you're good to go. But more likely you have wet line moving through your guides frequently, and you're going to have ice building up on all of those guides. If it is only happening intermittently because the temperature is only causing it intermittently, then dip your whole rod underwater and then quickly make some false casts. You say, well, it's just going to reform. Well, it breaks up that ice, it melts away because the water is warmer than the air. So it will give you temporary relief. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with your rod getting wet, and it's meant to get wet. What would I use as a preventative measure? Well, what I think works the best is to get some spray silicone and spray it on a rag. Make sure it's just the most basic stuff, no extra chemicals, and just put it in a little rag and then hit your guides with it. Just a little bit will go a very long way. In a pinch, chapstick works, but I don't think it scares the fish away. I don't think it certainly doesn't mess up your fly line. If you put it on your lips, you can put it on your fly line. But chapstick is a great backup option to have, and that's something to keep in your vest or your sling pack in case you do get in a difficult situation where things are freezing up. But for optimum adhering, both for using a silicone spray, which again, I wouldn't spray it on the rod itself. I'd spray in a rag and just rub it on each snake guide and the tip top. Make sure your guides and your rod are dry, and that's going to get the best use out of any of those products. There's a lot of other options people use. I know that people use fly line dressing, and it's because some of those have silicone in them, and then they definitely feel like they're not damaging their rod, their guides, or their line because they're using something that's designed to be used in that situation. Try out different things. As long as you're not popping that ice out of your guides, then you will be good. So I'll probably do another one of these sometime in the next few weeks, another winter fly fishing tips, technique kind of episode. But again, a lot of it is just slowing down and being very deliberate about your fishing if this is not something you've been doing or if you're going to a new stream. This week on Casting Across, 2 articles. The first one is called Even After Tomorrow, Trout Will Still Rise. Even after tomorrow, trout will still rise. So this is being recorded the day after the election, which is at the moment an ongoing process. Say what you will, vote who you want to vote for, but in my humble opinion, this is a bad look for our country, that we can't get this figured out much, much quicker, that we didn't anticipate that this was going to happen. Anyway, this is not why you have tuned in. I want people's votes to be counted and voices to be heard. I just think that we should have figured out a way to do it much, much quicker. That's my nonpartisan take. But this article is just a reminder that there's fish rising today. There'll be fish rising tomorrow, and that is a microcosm of how normal life will be on a day-by-day basis. Now, you could say, but what about this situation? What about these people? What about this conservation issue? What about this demographic? Okay, I get it. But if you go fishing, if you're able to get away, which we all get away from time to time, and if you're listening to this, you're interested in this, then you get away, there's going to be a fish rising, and you're going to be able to have a break. So just remember that and keep some perspective, and for not just fishing, but probably bigger things. Then my Wednesday article is called 3 Easy Steps for Fly Rod Care. I like my fly rods. I want them to function. So some of these things are very, very common sense, with a little bit of a twist. Some places that you don't necessarily think to clean, and some ways that you don't necessarily consider looking at your rods before you put them away for the winter. Unless, of course, you're fishing all winter long. But then you should still have some time where you go to clean them. This week's recommendation on the podcast are the 23 PS nymph rods from Risen Fly Fishing. If you go to risenfly.com, you will go to their fly rod page, and you'll see the 23 PS nymph rods. So I'd used a couple of nymph rods before, and I thought, this might be something I want to add to my arsenal of rods, but all the ones that I tried were ones that guides had or other people I was fishing with had, and they were all real high-end nymphing rods. I mean, $600, $700, $800 rods. I don't know if I want to invest that much. So I actually was sent the 23 PS nymph rod to demo before it was released, and I loved it, and I decided, I want this rod because it comes in at $299. There's an 11-foot 3-weight, a 10-foot 2-weight, and a 10-foot 3-weight. They're all 4-piece. They all have a fighting butt, and they're great rods. They perform as well as some of those high-end rods that I had fished with. But if you are interested in getting into the nymph rod game, if you want to fish this way in the winter, in the summer, year-round, whatever, if you want to use it just as a weighted tight line, or if you want to get into a more complicated nymphing rig setup, then I would definitely recommend checking out the 23 PS nymph rod. Awesome components, awesome blank, great action, wonderful sensitivity. I absolutely love it. For $299, it can't be beat. So risenfly.com. I will put a link to the 23 PS nymph rods on the show notes for this page of Casting Across. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com, where you'll find more info on this podcast and 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.
A life that has the stories to back it. A life to be proud of. It's a Winchester life.
Yeah, baby. 6'8" Western. Oh, mule deer, baby, right there.
Tune in every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on Waypoint TV.